So assess your antagonist. So, I feel like when you look at writing advice and writing guides, there's a lot of information about protagonists and not a whole lot about antagonists. And I think that's one of the reasons that antagonists end up seeming kind of like not fully rounded, they end up being more like caricatures. You know what I mean? So what is an antagonist? We know that an antagonist can be a person, right? A villain, a being with some kind of negative intention toward your protagonist. It can also be, it doesn't always have to be, depending on the genre you're writing. Nobody in here is writing from the perspective of a sentient crow, but there's a book I recently read called Hollow Kingdom, which the characters in the book are all animals because it's taking place at kind of in the middle of an apocalypse, and like the crow is observing what's happening to the world. So all the antagonists are animals. But an antagonist can also be any force that works against your protagonist, right? So I've got some suggestions here: poverty, job restrictions, family rules, social mores, larger forces of evil, and your character's own inner flaws can have an antagonist-like function in that they work against your character and they defeat them, prevent them from achieving obstacles, throw complications in their path. All right. So when we talk about antagonists, we're talking about multiple things. And I am, as I talk about kinds of antagonists, you'll see that there are some characters who become antagonists to your protagonist, but may not in and of themselves be bad, evil, or wrong. That makes sense. Especially when you come back to this idea of opposing forces. So a character who opposes the goals and the forces of your protagonist is in and of themselves acting like an antagonist, but that doesn't necessarily equal evil. And I think that's an older trope, that the antagonist was always evil and a villain. Right. And even if you think, like, I'm just going to use Nancy as an example, you've got the character Paul, right? He's an antagonist to Gabby, but I don't suspect that he's just an evil person. I think he's someone who was raised with some horrible behavior, probably abused himself. I'm going to give him some credit for being a human being who has learned bad behaviors. He's not evil. And I think that is something that the more we show our characters' humanity, even our antagonists, the more believable they are and the more the forces working against your character. Now, in someone like Sochi's story, like Nazism and fascism are an antagonist, right? So it's not even, it's like, yes, it's individual people, but there is a kind of groupthink that happens in that kind of mentality. David's, you've got some of that too, right? There's this kind of groupthink that happens with fascism that's not, it's almost like the individual mind becomes subsumed by the larger force. So I broke antagonists down into a few categories. Obviously, these are not all the categories in existence, but I thought this was a good way to look at them and to kind of assess your own antagonists and see where they fall into here, if they do or don't. So the one I feel like the most common is what we think of as like the power hungry, the Darth Vader of Star Wars fame, the Lord Voldemort of Harry Potter fame. And these characters seem to just be striving after power of some kind. They almost always seem to put that power ahead of their relationships. They often don't have any relationships. And they almost always have a backstory wound, but that backstory wound is often not revealed until the end of the series. Like Darth Vader, you don't learn anything about him until the very end. And then he starts to seem sympathetic, but up until that point, he's just bad. And for me, those actually are the least compelling antagonists. Like I find them not that, they're just easy to hate. And I think that this is becoming a trope that's phasing out a little bit in contemporary literature and movies. Then we have what you might call the self-righteous or the devout. And this is a character who lives by, abides by some kind of principle or cause or values. Could be religious, could be anything really. And because they have such a strict code of beliefs, they can behave in a way that looks antagonistic to people who don't fit into that code of beliefs. In fact, like I come from Jewish ancestry, and there's, the Hasidim, the very, very extreme Orthodox Jews, their mindset, they took a concept that makes sense. Okay, well, we've been persecuted and murdered over the years, so we're going to create communities that are insular. we're going to repopulate Jews. Like, it sounds like, you know, I can understand it. It makes sense. But instead they oppress women. They have, you know, there's all of these negative traits where they can act like antagonists within their own communities, the men in particular. So that's like an example of a self-righteous or a devout kind of potentially religious antagonist who believes what they're doing. So in their mind, they're righteous, right? I mean, and I think this is true of anyone in any kind of ideology. You know, we can look at the country right now, divided between ways of looking at things, right? So you might have a character who to themselves is perfectly behaving in a perfectly acceptable way, but to your protagonist, of course, is not. We've got the betrayed. This is also another kind of trope. You see a character who was hurt or over a betrayal or a misunderstanding or some kind of slight eventually turns to revenge, and that revenge drives their antagonism. And the example I pulled up is from, I don't know if any of you have seen this wonderful movie, The Incredibles. It's an animated film, but my dad and I saw it. My husband and I saw it before we had a kid, and it's a really charming movie. And these superheroes, there's these superheroes at this, and Mr. Incredible has this kind of admirer, this young child named Buddy, and he wants to help and he wants to be a superhero too. And Mr. Incredible sort of sends him away, mostly because he's trying to protect him. But Buddy takes that as a slight and harbors a vengeance for many, many years. And when he grows up, he becomes a villain against Mr. Incredible because he took it as a rejection, right? So now he's going to become better than, he's going to best him. So that's like betrayal can lead. Now that's a kind of a dramatic example, but betrayal can push characters to behave in ways they might not otherwise behave, hurt, pain. Then there's what I call the accidental antagonist, and this can take many different forms, but this is a character who might be essentially good, but has some insecurity, some wound, and because of that, in a moment when they are presented with an opportunity to be powerful, they take that power, they grab for that power, and it causes harm to the protagonist. Now, I don't know how many of you were fans of the show Game of Thrones or the books, but there's a character like that in this show in which he's sort of been raised alongside these brothers. He's not one of their brothers, but he's raised kind of like a foster. And when he has an opportunity to take power, he seizes it and turns against his family. And of course comes to regret it. You know, it works against him in the long run. But these tend to be insecure characters. And I do think that's a trait of a lot of antagonists have some deep insecurity. And it's sort of a metaphor in some ways. The antagonist is a metaphor for what is, you know, vulnerable and broken and not able to be easily healed. But also, you know, that which pushes your own protagonist to rise above and be better than, right? That's the other sort of function of an antagonist, is it asks your character to be better than the antagonist. And that's part of what it creates in the reader too, is this feeling of like, well, you don't want to stoop to their level, right? Then you've got the antagonist who triumphs, otherwise known as the anti-hero. And this is a character who is behaving badly, and yet we root for them. And it's kind of a cruel trick of the writer who can do this. There was a book series that I read it before it became a Netflix series called You. And this guy is essentially a stalker. It's narrated from his perspective. So you're in his mind at all times. And the way in which he justifies things becomes so compelling at different times that you start to root for him. And then later on, you kind of hate yourself for it. It's a very hard thing to pull off, but I've seen it time and time again. And I think it's another trope, you know, that's kind of popular right now. And then lastly, sometimes your protagonist is their own antagonist. And this can not only just be through character flaws, it could be a character who has dissociated from something they have done, whether that's in the realm of fantasy and science fiction, like, you know, a character who turns into a werewolf and doesn't know it, or a character who has trauma and in that trauma dissociates and behaves badly, or a character who has, what's it called now? Dissociative identity disorder, is that it, Yannicka? It used to be multiple personality. You probably know it.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. Dissociative identity disorder.
So you could have a character who struggles with that, who is unaware of things, or at least appears to be unaware of actions they're taking when one of their other personalities is sort of, you know, guiding the show. So you might look through your story again and kind of review what kind of, and again, yours might not fit into any of these categories. Again, come back to that idea too, that your protagonists can work against themselves, and that forces and events and acts of nature can work against them and are not necessarily an antagonist in villainy, but they are preventing your character from getting what they want, achieving goals, etc. So the function of the antagonist, in some stories, the antagonist is like a character unto themselves and has almost an equal role to the protagonist. And of course, I couldn't think of anything off the top of my head, but I know I have read these. In this case, the antagonist has to undergo a journey of change or transformation as well as the protagonist. And this could be more like characters that start out as enemies, or romance gone bad, where the characters, you know, seem evil and then kind of become redeemed. These are usually stories of redemption, I should say. And in most cases, the antagonist exists to force your protagonist into the actions and change necessary for the plot, right? So they're the device by which you push and press and test your protagonist to change, to take action, to do things differently. And sometimes that change comes quickly, and sometimes that change comes slowly over time and through the course of your story. In terms of the power dynamics, so we've talked about plot structure a little bit in this class, right? We have this kind of 4 key energetic markers where the story turns upon itself a little bit. And what you want to kind of envision is that the antagonist does have to be stronger and have more control for about 2/3 of your book. And you know, it is toward the end that we sort of show that transformation. Now, your character can be growing and changing all the way along the way, but never to the point where they are sort of free from the grip of the antagonist. And, you know, like Yannicka, in your story, the camp itself is an antagonist for your character. You know, old pain and old wounds can be an antagonist. Again, it doesn't have to be a person, right?
Yeah.
And the idea is that the protagonist, with all of the energy of the antagonist forces, the protagonist is strengthening and growing, but you really only see how much they've grown around the climax, which is around the 2/3 mark or a little further of the novel or the story. You know, that's when you really see what all of this has been worth or for, you know, how much it's changed your protagonist. Now, there might be moments along the way where your protagonist gains temporary strength and looks like they have the upper hand, but then you're going to have usually a reversal where that advantage is lost. Nancy, it occurs to me that scene where Gabby has left and gone and met Tim and had her affair. She seems like she's overcome Paul. She seems like she's let him go. And we're like, great, we're rooting for her. And then she has another reversal when he comes back and he abuses her. And the same thing happens later on, right? When she's done with him again, she's at her parents' house and then he comes again, right? So there's these reversals because your character is slowly building up the strength that they need to finally become the victor in their own lives, the champion of their own destiny. If that makes sense. What's that?
Helping.
Yeah, right. And often the protagonist becomes powerful in precisely the ways the antagonist can't or won't. So it's reflecting that your protagonist has greater strength or values, right? It's often like your protagonist shows true courage. Your protagonist shows true love. Your protagonist shows bravery that the antagonist doesn't really have. Maybe the antagonist has to rely upon weapons or other people to do their dirty work, or, you know, et cetera. So if you think about like great books and TV and movies you've read or, you know, seen, and you think about that protagonist antagonist relationship, you might notice that it is always the protagonist shows the higher skills and qualities, but it's hard won and hard earned over the course of the story. So this will be our one and only exercise for today. I want us to write what motivates your antagonist. And if you have more than one, that's fine, just pick one. So what motivates your antagonist if they are a person, ideally a person? How did they become this way? And if it's something like you're going to draw on larger forces, you can talk about the history. How did this camp come into being? Or how did fascism, you know, how did Hitler rise to power? Whatever you want to talk about. What is the connection between protagonists and antagonists? How do they know each other? How did they come to be interacting with one another or in that situation? And then think about how often your antagonist opposes your protagonist. Is it only a handful of times? Is it pretty significantly or frequently? And again, if you're not answering this question as it's a person, just answer these questions to the best of your ability. And I'll give us about 5 minutes to wait. Just take a minute to just finish up your sentence. Oh, there's a big fly in my room. Go on. Go on. It's your chance. Trying to release the fly. Go. He's too dumb to live. Okay. So, sorry, I have to text my husband what I want for dinner because he's gonna pick it up for me. Garlic pizza. It's pizza night. Okay. So, who would like to read any of that they were just writing? Nancy?
Sure. I decided that when I started this exercise that I would not choose Paul as the antagonist.